Well, good afternoon. This is the wrap-up. The wrap-up in the sense that we have here six panelists and two of them have not yet been paneled, so they're really new panelists, John and Roy. And we thought what we'd do is ask them to think through the 2 days here and share with you and give their ideas on what are the themes they think should be carried forward. They've heard the recommendations that Doug has just put up, but what would they go home and tell their grandmother that we accomplished? What is the message that they think is the most important? Now, both John and Roy have not had the chance to speak, so we'll give them a couple of extra minutes, but what we'll do is ask John and Roy to give us 3 to 5 minutes talk on what they think are the issues that we should have covered that we didn't in other presentations, and then we'll go down and ask each of the panelists to continue with a brief thought, and then we'll get into questions and answers. So, John, I'll let you start off and give my best to Governor Christie when you go back.
But, I certainly will, yes. I wanted to start with a little perspective on New Jersey, and that we've had a presidential disaster declaration every year since 2004, at least once. And we are the most densely populated state. I say we, I grew up in Pennsylvania, so but New Jersey is my adopted state. So outside of the Gulf Coast states, New Jersey leads the National Flood Insurance Program in total claim dollars paid. So we are extremely flood prone. So in the past, just looking at the last 8-9 years, the governor and the New Jersey legislature have formed fact-finding bodies to address flooding events. And this was the case for Delaware River flooding that occurred in 2004, 2005, and then again in 2006. And we also had a commission in the Passaic River Basin, and that was after flooding in 2007, then flooding again in 2010, and then we had it again in 11 twice in March, and then followed by hurricanes Irene and Lee later that year. So for pre-Sandy actions, it was very clear this Governor Christie, was on top of things as far as preparation and immediate response. He had conference calls with municipalities. OEMs were invited to be on the calls. There was a real team effort in getting ready and immediate response from Hurricane Sandy. There's been a continuation of that centralized control up into this period of time in terms of recovery and rebuilding. The task force for the Passaic, and I'd like to draw the contrast between this. The Passaic Commission, in my mind, was created to revive a large tunnel project that the Corps had come up with. And Jury visited us, our commission, when we were deliberating. And we came out with a very different report that talked about buyouts and other non-structural methods and a diverse group of methods to address the Passaic River Basin flooding. Buyouts was a big part of that, and it has continued. And the governor followed the recommendations of that commission, and there is a large-scale buyout effort going on. So here we get to Hurricane Sandy. And I use the word hurricane because I find, this is my personal opinion, that Superstorm Sandy gives the idea of it's not going to happen again, or people think it was a unique event and we're just not going to see it again. I use hurricane while it's not quite correct, because when Sandy hit the Jersey coast, it was not a hurricane by definition, but its results were a hurricane, and again, the superstorm just throws it a little bit. So there was record flooding in Ocean and Monmouth counties, New Jersey. The previous storm was the 1962 storm. That was a nor'easter that held the record. So once again, the centralized control came from the governor's office. He decided in this case that a single point person, I'm calling it the Sandy Czar, but he's actually the director of the governor's office of recovery and rebuilding, would be the point person for this recovery effort. And it is a cabinet level position, directly reporting to the governor. There's no in between. This is a new person. He has a background as a prosecutor. But just again, as a contrast, Governor Cuomo said, let me form these large commissions. Let's give them a very short time, and I need them to report out to me. It was very, very unlike what New Jersey did in terms of keeping the control right in the governor's office. So again, this is the same governor that formed a commission once before. A previous governor had formed a commission in another situation. This time, the governor's office is keeping that control right inside. So what are we hearing from the governor? Well, first of all, he wants an expedited restoration. His initial thinking was something like we can get back and going by Memorial Day of 2013. That's looking very difficult to do in some of the communities, but that's the aim. And then within a couple years, maybe we can get back to a full recovery. There's a lot of signs that pace of restoration is being prioritized above the resiliency or building resiliency into our future conditions. One of the first things the governor did was pass an administrative order that for replacement of public infrastructure and public facilities, that there would be no permitting required. It basically gave, hey, if you want to build it back the way it was, go for it. You don't have to wait for us to approve that. That was kind of an early sign of, hey, we may not get resiliency out of this thing. At the time of this paper that I wrote for this conference, or for this forum, there was no directive on regional planning. There's no rebuilding with resiliency. We're not getting any real direction out of the governor's office. And pretty much everything was being left to the municipalities, the 566 municipalities. Of course, not every municipality in New Jersey was directly affected. Most of the state lost power, but we have a lot of communities that are kind of going it on their own, so to speak. That changed a little bit yesterday, and the governor made an announcement with the $1.8 billion coming through HUD in block grants, that he's going forward with a massive elevation process with homes that were damaged during Sandy, and even homes that weren't damaged during Sandy along the coast. So that's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out. He did adopt advisory base flood elevation mapping that was released in mid-December, and along with that was an emergency rule which updated or amended the Flood Hazard Area Control Act rule in the state of New Jersey. And that's the good news, that the advisory base flood elevation maps were adopted. The sort of dug down what the media didn't cover was this rule gave more power to municipalities, not to state government, to oversee things. It expanded the permit by rule provisions, and again, that there's more responsibility on the local floodplain administrator, who's, in my opinion, in New Jersey, was not adequately prepared for this kind of event. And then, as far as the governor's office, there's been very little in public releases, strategies, milestones, those type of things. It's pretty much, hey, let's get it back, let's rebuild, let's get up for the next vacation season. So some of the complications, at least in New Jersey, and how it plays into what we're doing here is, New Jersey is a home rule state. We stated that in our breakout group. There have been land use checks with certain commissions in New Jersey. There's a Meadowlands Commission, there's a Pinelands Commission, also a Highlands Commission. Governor Kane, when he was in office in 1988, called for a coastal commission. Those are fighting words right now. You probably don't want to go there unless you want an argument. I think personally it's a pretty good idea, but this governor is not in any way supporting any kind of regional authority. His appointments to the existing regional authorities have been showing that he does not like that kind of way of controlling land use. I don't know how to say that tactfully. But there's some really interesting things coming out of this, such as redistribution of the tax burden. The most at-risk buildings have been reassessed, and the new tax burden's going on the least risky properties. And that will play out. There's going to be a lot of interesting things that will come. So you have the taxpayer who built right or bought right, and they're going to be paying the price for the ones that aren't, just like the federal taxpayer is in this case. There's a real, again, push for resumption of vacation as a vacation destination, the beaches, the rental properties, boardwalks. There's been a lot of push by mayors. Let's get the boardwalk back. That's the status. We need that back. We need, a boardwalk. That's going to make us whole again. And it's fascinating to watch. Maintaining economic health is being looked at in the short run, I think, rather than the long run, and maintaining employment. So is Sandy going to be the opportunity for risk adaptation? I'd like to think so, and I'm personally not giving up our New Jersey Association for Floodplain Management. We're not done. We have a lot to do. We have a dialogue with the governor's office. I started that soon after Sandy and soon after the Sandy Czar was announced, and we're going to keep having that dialogue. We are emphasizing public safety as the #1 priority, and that our recommendations are all about lives, and we keep reminding everyone we talk to that 38 lives were lost in Hurricane Sandy in the state. So we keep marching ahead. We're trying to avoid our group that Sandy becoming a case study and something to learn from. We should have already learned. We should have learned from Katrina. We should have learned from other disasters and the disasters we had in the state of New Jersey, so that we can do the right thing during in our recovery from Hurricane Sandy. So, but all this is playing out in real time. You're constantly checking the media. This has been 3 months of or a little over 3 months of constant dynamic changes, and I'm sure there's going to be changes ahead, hopefully for the better.
Great. Well, thank you very much, John. That's a good
Thanks,
summary. I do compliment your governor on being there, being in the forefront, and being willing to address these issues instead of hiding in Trenton. Roy?
So I'm going to try to lay it out this way, although I'm mindful that there's all kind of devastation that keeps occurring behind me. And so occasionally I watch your eyes kind of move off. What exactly are you seeing?
These are photos I took. Most of these are Seabright, New Jersey. Right. It was the first day people were allowed back into the town. There's some photos also from Long Beach Island, excuse me, and there's a couple photos from the, there's maybe one photo from Spring Lake, New Jersey. So just to give you a flavor. Right. Sorry.
No. So what I want to do is kind of lay this out pretty simply. I want to talk about two audiences, two views, how we can triangulate this, and then I'll wait for Margaret to say something provocative, at which point I can sound reasonable in response. Just so we get our expectations lined up. I was struck by my friend from Milwaukee's comment that was made yesterday morning. And I think the work of this group needs particularly to be mindful of the two audiences that are here. There is an expert space that lives in the academic and engineering community, and there is also a usable space of where this stuff needs to go on. The work of the Coast can too often get stuck in a high-minded group of people who barely understand it, or if they do, they can barely communicate it. And I think that as we're doing this, and even as we're working the papers and the outbriefs of this, we need to find ways to make sure we are communicating to both audiences, because there's so much to be brought from the scientific and expert community. But we need to understand that most of these decisions are made on the ground. They're made by elected officials. They're made by other kind of building officials. They're made by private industry in terms of where they site and where they're going to go. And we need to ensure that what we are offering back out is communicating to both of those in a way that is credible. And so, first of all, we need to make sure we're addressing two audiences. Secondly, I think we need to address, there are two views that people can take of this. There is, I'm recovering from my coastal disaster, and I haven't had my coastal disaster yet. And the options are different for those. The kind of opportunities that are available in New York and New Jersey today are different than the options that are available out Margaret's place there in South Carolina. There's a lot of money being spent there. There's entire areas like Seabright that has been removed. And so you are starting almost from whole cloth. Whereas in much of the coastline, we're dealing with people who have direct property interests. There are economic engines that are in place. And I think as we're rolling something out to understand these coastal risks and what we do about them, we need to understand the two opportunities and ensure that we are frankly exploiting the realities of them both. It's too easy to talk about the post-disaster space, but I actually think there are opportunities in the pre-disaster space that need to be exploited. And then we need to triangulate. And you guys posed it in a few different ways in the ALF brief that Doug Placentia gave. But in my mind, there are three dimensions that we have to bring to the lens at any point. There is a social dynamic, there is an economic dynamic, and there's a science dynamic. And you can split that into 5 or 7 or 17 if you'd like to. But the point by which we are most effective is when we triangulate as opposed to act against them. I think too often it's easier to fall prey to this idea that we are going to hold the economic against the science, or we're going to hold the people against the economic drivers. We talked some about the fact that so much of the nation's economy is dependent on the coast. And I think it is too simplistic and frankly too easy to get into a space that says we can hold those as, oh, it's just a tension we've got to hold against each other. And rather, I'd like to take a Clintonism and say we should triangulate, which says we've got to optimize the space between where the people, the economy, and the science come together. Because successful answers are going to find that space in between. As we've done quite a bit of work in New York and New Jersey in these last, we're almost at 4 months, I guess. We're talking about some of the realities and some of the politics that are in play there, some of the choices that are being made. But frankly, we're watching communities make a lot of the right decisions right now. Maybe not always for the right reasons, but we can debate that on another day, by which we're sitting in communities with people who are trying to figure out what is next. Biggert-Waters, the Reform Act of the National Flood Insurance Program, while it has some sharp edges to it, where it's headed from an actuarial rate perspective is one of the incentives. It is one of the incentives that is being used across that space, because you start looking at the numbers, and it was in your opening presentation, you borrowed or stole one of our slides that works so effectively in communities. Set aside the V zone. Let's just deal with that coastal A zone kind of space. What it's going to cost to maintain insurance in that area is a point by which the economics are playing out, at which point they're not fighting us on the science any longer. They're figuring out how they're going to live there. So as we do this, and I'll then just turn it to the panel, but I think we've got to make sure that we understand both audiences, and when we put a paper out there, it speaks to both. That we speak to both the pre and post environment, and we triangulate rather than pose a whole bunch of competing tensions. because real solutions that change and adapt on the ground are going to address all three dimensions of the social, the people component, the economic elements, as well as the science.
Good, thank you, Roy. We'll come back and ask some questions. Larry, you've been listening and been participating in these for a long time. What's new on this weekend?
First of all, I don't live in as many spaces as Roy does. One of the things that the theme that's been running through, and I think you'll see a lot of in our recommendations, is the discussion of sustainability. One of the issues I wanted to talk about is, and I've also heard the word a lot, John used it and the governor used it, resilience. I wanted to remind us that these two are not the same thing. I was reminded of this a few weeks ago, that sustainability is really long-term and resilience may not necessarily be long-term. I may live on a barrier island and elevate my structure and become more resilient, but that doesn't mean that the barrier island I'm on is sustainable. That may be a fine point, but I bring that back to the taxpayer dollars that we're providing more and more at 100%, as John says in New Jersey, and the need to tie those dollars to sustainability, real sustainability. We're not saying we're not going to help you. We're saying if we do, this is a one-off deal. Do it right, and that means become sustainable.
Denise?
Thank you, Jerry. I think you asked us to, provide a few thoughts on what we'd heard in the last couple of days, and I think one thing is coming here as one of the coastal folks living on the coast, living right down on the Gulf Coast, and having been through a number of events. I think one of the things that I've found very interesting here, I am a scientist rather than a flood manager, but the number of insights that there are for us to gain on the coast of Louisiana from the experiences that you all have had on inland river flooding is really quite enormous. I've learned a huge amount about communities and insurance and those kinds of things, which I think many, many lessons that I can take home. But one thing I think I would want to just make sure that we do all leave with, and I wonder, Doug, if this does come through in the recommendations, it might be a little bit implicit, is we focus quite a lot in our discussions and the breakouts that I've been in anyway, and I sense this from the report outs of the others, is on the events, on the Sandys, on the Katrinas. I don't know how many times, Katrina's been the baseline for the discussion, and that's fine because there's a lot to learn from it. But I think that within the context of many of the things we've been discussing here, there is the event and the disaster, but there's also, at least in the coastal situation, this chronic long-term increase in flooding, which is not going to be disaster assistance, but it's going to really, really impact the quality of life. Where I live in coastal Louisiana, it's a very, very low-lying environment, and because of coastal subsidence and sea level rise, the whole environment gets closer to the water day after day, year after year. And so what that means is that coastal roads flood not just during storms, but during high tides and strong wind events. And that means that the school bus doesn't get through. That means that you can't get to work. It really starts to be a day-to-day quality of life kind of issue. And so I want us to make sure that we don't, in our recommendations, lose sight of those particular things that go on at the coast relative to sea level rise and climate change. In our case, exacerbated by subsidence and other things. But the storms are one part of the story. Even if you don't get a storm, even if you live in a part of the coast like Georgia, which happens to be in this kind of sweet spot on the Atlantic coast, which seems to be somehow immune or has been for some time, still is a real impact of climate change and sea level rise on coastal flooding, which we have to work out how to deal with.
Margaret?
So it might amuse you to know that last night as Denise and I were walking home, we were each discussing what our backup plans were. So where are you going to go?
Yeah. I'm going to Donaldsonville. She's going to Asheville.
I actually want to emphasize what Denise just said. I just changed my thought. A few years ago, when my benevolent dictator mayor was trying to put in a new storm pump system like they had in New Orleans, I went to him to provide technical assistance to his lawyers and engineers, and I showed him two things, a precursor actually of that visualization viewer that you all saw yesterday. One was, to torture me, my own crew had shown me that the LIDAR data, the most recent LIDAR data in the southeastern coastal plains, very clearly demonstrated that the elevation data on my plat map from the 1940s overstated my elevation by at least a meter. So I wasn't actually at 8.5, I was really more like at 5.5. So I showed this to the mayor, so we were actually a meter less than we all thought we were, and he's a short guy, so that was really important. And that, if you add just a meter of water on top of that, high tide flooding in the streets of downtown Charleston would go from 10 or a dozen times a year to over 200 times a year. Now, we have a tourism-based economy, and for some reason, Yankees don't like to wade through crotch-deep water. I don't know why. Because Denise and I do. So I think that's actually an important thing that you raised. So yes, there would be incentives. I'm happy to have incentives to elevate my 1945 brick bungalow, and aren't you glad I sold the big house in town and downsized? But that's only if I get wiped out. And the odds of me getting wiped out, I don't know what they are because the storm patterns are shifting. So what's my incentive to elevate or set back absent a disastrous event? Even if I am experiencing chronic, repetitive flooding. Oh yes, my insurance premiums, that's right. So I think that's important. I liked what you just said, Roy, and it actually reminded me about Gilbert White. So for those of you who are less familiar with our godfather, Gilbert White, he was a Quaker. And besides being intellectually really smart and incredibly productive, he was a Quaker, and Quakers believe in gentle persuasion. So in one of those altered realities that Roy's exist in, I think we should actually use the tool of gentle persuasion.
Yeah, I'll come back to that. That just doesn't seem to fit your personality.
I think it was FDR that said, "White, right? Walk softly and carry a big stick."
Nick?
Thanks. I think I've given the impression sometimes over the last couple of days that we're in the UK. We have some sort of paradigm of adaptability and sustainability, and we've got it all sorted, which is something for which I apologise because it's a total lie. We've got a fairly bulletproof, we're developing a fairly bulletproof system of laws and policies and planning instruments and what have you to make sure that there's a sort of line of sight from top to bottom, that we've got all the right things in there in Westminster and in our head offices in the Environment Agency. But that we're still learning in terms of actually doing things on the ground, just like you in this forum have been really trying to sort of do some free thinking about how we can actually get this to happen, how we can get people on board, the people who are actually at the front line of this on board. We're still very much at that place. I mentioned some of the adaptation measures that we're doing, and we're trying to sort of get these bespoke funding instruments to help support that. But that's what they are, they're bespoke funding instruments. Our ministry will have coughed up £11 million here, the Crown Estate will cough up some more millions there, but it's not systematic, and it's not something which is embedded in people's thinking at the coast in England any more than it is here. So we're all learning, and I think it's been a real pleasure and a privilege for me to be here to actually engage in lots of the discussions that have been going on over the last couple of days, for which thank you very much. Of course, I need to take things back when I go home, and I need to tell my superiors of what a great job you're doing in the US, and look, can't we just learn and actually get things doing better, which is probably what you'll be doing on the counterparts. And so it's a bit of a game, isn't it? But one of the things that struck me was actually yesterday's presentation at lunchtime on the mapping tool that you've got on the website. And before I came here, I obviously did a bit of homework on US flood management, and I went onto the website NOAA, and I saw that mapping tool. I thought, crikey, I'm going to get slaughtered in this place. They've got this absolutely sorted out. Look at this fantastic piece of internet communication. It's got everything there. You've got your different layers. It's interactive. It's exciting. You can see the water levels rising. I haven't mentioned it, but over the last few years in the Environment Agency, I've been involved in developing a mapping tool on our website, which is part of a suite of maps, which shows coastal erosion predictions into the next 20, 50, 100 years. Quite brave, but boy, has it been a battle. Politically, it's very politically hot. It doesn't affect many people, but because the results of falling off a cliff essentially are so final. Funnily enough, the politicians have been a bit nervous about us splashing this all over the internet, and that has been a game. But we're now in a place where only on Thursday a minister came to a conference that I was at, and he had stood up and he was challenged from the floor. But he said, "No, we've got to treat people like grown-ups. We've got to. People are smart. We need to give them the information. We need to all be in this together, as it were. We as a government need to provide some kind of support, and we're still working that out." On that adaptation, but he stood behind this initiative, and I just thought that mapping tool. I thought that's in a sense the next step. Our mapping tools are quite static in some ways, whereas I love that sort of interaction and really getting people thinking about what that your local place is going to look like 6 feet under, as it were. So I thought that was very, very intelligent, and I'm going to take that one back particularly. So I'll leave it there for the moment, but thank you very much for inviting me here and allowing me the opportunity to engage in your discussion. It's been great.
Well, certainly, thank you very much for coming this far to be with us and to share. Let me ask a couple of questions, and I'll start with you, Nick. A couple of reports, the Pitt report and some earlier foresight, have pointed out that you all face some unusual challenges, that you've got this stuff called pluvial flooding. And the interaction of pluvial and coastal and riverine flooding creates a problem, and maybe a third of your damages are pluvial. How do we factor that into these coastal communities, the large urban, not the Seabrights, but the larger ones, where you have to put these two together? What are you doing with that?
Yeah, that's very true. The 2007 floods that I think I've mentioned a few times prompted a report by Sir Michael Pitt, which was a big review, which is, I think, what was something along the lines of what was being talked about earlier on. We rather than each individual organisation going, how did we work there? How did our systems work? This review is all about going, how did it all work in the round? How did different organisations with different responsibilities work together? And that was a classic example where for pluvial flooding, it's the local authority's responsibility, and it's also, of course, water companies and sewerage companies' responsibilities to work out how our combined storm overflows work. And then it's the Environment Agency's responsibility to look at sea flooding and flooding from large rivers. And one of the effects of the 2007 floods was a place called Hull. I mentioned it. It's the Venice of the North. And that's a very low-lying city in the north of England, which was really affected by the interaction of river flooding and some tidal flooding and pluvial flooding. Because when the rivers overflowed, a lot of the systems that were taking relief from the pluvial flooding just got backed up and just came up in the city. So that was a real problem. And when you're dealing with quite old systems, as we are, of drainage and of sewerage networks and what have you, it's quite a big, expensive job to actually retrofit and redesign. It's not going to happen overnight. But in terms of the management of it, you can actually streamline it. And we're getting a lot more organisationally better at that. One of the things that we have are regional flood defence committees, which are basically Environment Agency officials with local authority officials, and they decide in each region where to invest, where the priorities are, and they sort of administer our overall budget at that regional level. Now they've been reconstituted as regional flood and coastal committees, so that they're actually forcing the people on those boards to make sure that there's a proper balance between coastal investment and inland investment, and that the things that they do actually join up and complement each other. So that's a good example of institutionally how people are really sort of getting around a table. But the other thing to mention, of course, in terms of pluvial is sustainable drainage, whether that's sustainable rural drainage or sustainable urban drainage. And finally, I think we're just about getting there in the UK, where this is becoming much more part of what developers do, to actually install drainage systems within a development, whether it's the permeability of the surfaces or whether it's swales and settling pools or what have you, which can actually just take the pressure, make that community more resilient. Even at quite small scales, it can work if you sort of add that up. So you're right, it has to be all sources of flooding, but it does need to be interconnected. And I think if you can get that in there in the way that the whole flood management structure is set up, then you're halfway there, really.
Roy and John, you see New York and New Jersey, and what's happening to follow up on what Nick said? Are there specific steps being taken to make sure that we've talked a lot about residential and that sort of problem, but what about the infrastructure for the communities? We've really not spent a lot of time on that.
Well, the administrative order that I pointed out was basically build it back as it was, in terms of immediate recovery. So that sort of gives you one angle of it. I am seeing some communities doing the opposite. They are adding more freeboard than the state is requiring. They're requiring coastal V zone standards in A zones. And yesterday the governor announced that Route 33 would be rebuilt, and that's basically the north-south, basically the causeway for getting around the shore, a good part of it, at least like 12 miles of it. So, and that would be built stronger and better and everything. No, I'm not seeing a lot in that way. I'm not seeing a whole lot. We had wastewater treatment plants that were down for weeks. We had all kinds of different infrastructure. We had actually some areas that were not as affected by Sandy, but because of the power. Well, it is Sandy, but the power loss had some water restrictions in certain areas of New Jersey. So we do have an infrastructure that needs to be considered in the rebuilding, and certainly even without a Sandy involved, we certainly needed attention.
Roy?
I can speak to the point by which federal dollars begin to get involved and the conversations that have been going on between FEMA, Secretary Donovan's staff, and others that are involved as we look at these elements. And the conversations, which are ongoing, and those decisions have not been taken yet, is to look, particularly in the FEMA programs, what does it look like if there's going to be public assistance dollars in play? What standards should you be rebuilding to, or what should we be paying for on that front? And it's easy at this point, given the standards, it is the advisory flood elevation level +1 is the baseline we're starting there. But Craig's asked us directly, but what is the right level by which these should be built to? And that's opened up a lot of conversations, and it gets to where do you see the future from a climate perspective, from a sea level rise, but not just that. We're dealing with the intensity of the events, and we start dealing with what does surge inundation look like. And I can imagine us getting to a place by which we land at some kind of stair-stepping reality by which we hold residential to one level, we hold a community center to another level, a fire station to another, and a wastewater treatment plant to another. And we've got to find ways to make our benefit cost ratios work in that space. But if you have a wastewater treatment plant, and this, whether we're talking in New Jersey, we've had these conversations in New York as well, there is going to be a flood defense. Okay, we understand that in these areas. To put 2 more feet on that is a nominal cost. And it's the right cost because you don't want to have to replace it again. Conversations going on. There's a little power authority on that big skinny island in New York that ran into some problems. And so there's a lot being rebuilt in that space. And Craig's challenge back to us is how do we inform that with the right data? We're not to a point of having that resolved, but given the vigor and the level by which those conversations are going on right now, I feel confident that to the degree federal dollars are involved off the supplemental, there will be higher standards that are being applied.
Any comments from the other panelists on this topic of infrastructure rebuilding?
Well, I would just, I'm not an expert in the federal funding side of things, but just having watched infrastructure being damaged and over again in coastal Louisiana over the last 20 years, my observation is that, particularly reflecting on the electrical utilities, is that is still a problem. And I don't know how many impacts we've had, how many times the power has gone out for a week at my house in the last 20 years, but they just don't seem to ever fix it any differently. The oil and gas industry, however, when Hurricane Andrew came through in 1992, really ripped apart a lot of the inshore facilities that had been there for decades. And they rebuilt very, very differently. They rebuilt high, they rebuilt hard, and they rebuilt in a very robust way. And so what I see there is two private entities reacting to events that they know are going to happen again in very, very different ways. But I think that what the reasons for those responses are is certainly unclear to me, but one of them, certainly the utility, has some responsibility to the Public Service Commission, but the oil and gas industry does not. And so I don't know what makes those things work, but there are things that you can do. I've certainly seen some do it and others not.
I think it's just those learnings from the Gulf Coast and Florida, which Craig has been pushing us and saying, simply putting it back the way it was, and maybe it needs to be relocated, and maybe it needs to be fortified in different ways. Those conversations are going on. The proof's always in the pudding. Let's see what actually happens on the other side of it.
Yeah.
But it's a different kind of dialogue going on today than may have been seen in the past.
Well, this takes us to the people getting a message and reacting differently. Your gentle persuasion idea that we've seen in the literature time and time again that risk communication is very poor with dealing with floods. Smoking communication of the risk was good because we enforced it. We came up with bad things that would happen to you, etc. How do we make that move, especially in the coast? When you look at inland, I can understand in Iowa or somewhere where that's a bad choice, somewhere where they haven't had a lot of floods recently. But on the coastal areas of the United States, you go all up and down the East Coast across the Gulf, there's been hurricane after hurricane. These people certainly ought to know. How do we get the message across, Margaret? What do we do?
Well, first of all, and let's also remember that in New England, before Sandy, whatever you choose to call it, some of our major disastrous events were actually nor'easters, winter storm events. So there's that. I think that you have to separate individuals in their homes from the issue of public investments. You heard me yesterday talk about the difference between publicly financed, publicly funded, publicly insured infrastructure, public infrastructure. I think there we actually owe ourselves an obligation to ensure that those public infrastructure investments, wherever they occur, have to be hazard and climate resilient, because we actually can't really afford to keep rebuilding the same old stuff, which of course is why the oil and gas industry already went there. They're a bottom line kind of agency. So I think that's really a place that we can really focus, because first of all, even absent legislation, as I said, you can set up criteria for how you hand out money. That's part of what a number of us do on a regular basis. Secretaries of different agencies can issue administrative orders within their own agency that establish these kinds of criteria for funds they put out the door. So not just FEMA, community development block grants. I picked on EDA yesterday because it's in commerce, but community development block grant is a really big deal for lots of smaller communities. That's actually how they usually fund their water and sewer stuff. So I think we can begin working certainly with the smaller communities, because there are opportunities, I think, there in some places to work with them. And I think individual homeowners will almost always begin to follow the infrastructure. So I'm going to digress because the statute of limitations has transpired. Back in '73, I ran a disaster field office out of Thibodaux, Louisiana, some flood event. And one of the things, that was pre-FEMA, actually. So I worked for this little agency called HUD. And one of the things I thought that was incredibly perverse, so this is the Atchafalaya Basin, and it was my job to ensure that people who were flooded out got put into housing. But they were only eligible to be put into this assisted housing if they had lived in housing with standardized plumbing to begin with. Now, many of you don't know the Atchafalaya Basin, but there are many of our cousins who have never seen a single foot of plumbing in the Atchafalaya Basin. And I myself then, at the age of 23, thought it was incredibly perverse. That maybe if we expose some of these individuals to toilets, they might choose to stick with toilets. Okay, so everybody who came through my DFO came from standardized plumbing. You know, I don't think HUD intended to be perverse, but it was pretty perverse. And I think that we have a lot of programs that we need to look at, and if nothing else, squeeze out the perversity.
Well, Larry, let me jump to you for that, because this gets into the barriers. Not that you're perverse.
As someone who grew up without plumbing and without electricity, I understand that. What's interesting is in that discussion about investment in public infrastructure, as I talk to, we're going to see our model moving more toward PPP, that is private funding, public-private partnerships in order to fund their infrastructure. And when I talk to those people who have huge amounts of billions to invest in this, one of the things they want to hear about is, we're not going to invest in this unless there's some kind of reasonable standards that know that our investment's going to be protected, especially related to hazards. So in a way, they're looking toward some national set of standards for sure, or at least some national, statewide, or community set of standards that can be applied universally that they know somehow reasonably protects their investment. So they can tell their investors, yes, we've got an investment opportunity here to help this community and build the infrastructure for them and manage it and operate it, which is a lot of what the PPPs do now. But they want a reasonable set of standards that know they can protect that investment.
I'll now turn it over to you in the audience to see if you can grill this panel with some good ideas. And what I'd ask you to do is direct the comment to the person you'd like to have answer it, but I will tell you anyone will feel free to join in, so you won't be protected by picking on one. Yes, Bill?
Well, I don't know who to direct this to, but
well,
it's...
Hold it. You want it captured on the record. Can you use that one and I'll take this one?
I'm not sure who to direct this to, but I have a question about comparing and contrasting Katrina and Sandy. It seems like attitudes have changed, and when I talk to people who call my office who have been affected by Sandy, they're not questioning the fact that this will happen again. And it seems to me in Katrina, there was a lot of this was a mega event, hadn't happened to that scale before, unlikely to happen again by the local people. I'm wondering if folks on the panel, at least the American-based folks on the panel, sorry, Nick, have a similar perspective, or is this just my New York-centric view of things?
Can I say something on that, Jerry? Just because I think that the difference may be, and obviously I didn't see Katrina from the outside, I saw it from close in, but the flooding within the city of New Orleans was associated with, if I can put it generally, the failure of some kind of structure, rather than just the inundation of the storm event. And so I think that was the kind of thing that was unexpected and not not expected to happen again. The idea that you have a levee in front of you and all of a sudden that is washed out was the thing that was unexpected, not the fact that there was a storm and that there was flooding. And so in some of the other areas outside of the system where there were flooding, I think that it was a storm. They hadn't had one for a long time, but in the areas that weren't behind the levees that, inverted commas, failed, then I think the perception was somewhat different. Unfortunately, I think that the flooding of the city and the holding of the water in the bowl, if you like, gained so much attention that was probably what people were reacting to. Does that sound reasonable to you?
Yes.
Yeah, you understand the geography.
Yes.
But outside of the city itself, people are very used to flooding, fed up with it, but used to flooding.
Well, and the reality is in both geographies, we had already run scenarios, we had even run drills that envision situations not wholly dissimilar from what unfolded. But I think the other difference is just how much stuff has happened in the 8 years between Katrina and Sandy, you know, everywhere, every topic, you know. So we've seen a lot of flood pictures. We've seen a lot of destruction over the last 8 years. And I think that for normal people, that begins to have an impact. You know, repetition is one of the ways in which people begin to get messages, you know. So Jerry, though, I do want to remind you that it was nearly 35 years between when, what did we call him, whatever his name was, Califano, whatever his title was, the guy who said we really should stop smoking because it has bad health effects. It was actually 35 years later before we saw that trend move across society, just like seatbelts, but different. So the other thing is, I think the children. So lots of people started wearing seatbelts, or they stopped smoking, not because they knew intellectually it was the right thing to do. Lord knows it took me a long time to quit smoking, but because there were other pressures.
Right.
And that's part of the gentle persuasion. There are many ways to skin a cat. You know, the direct assault hasn't been working for us. You should do this. It doesn't work for lots of people to be told what to do. They have to come to that space.
Well, perhaps risk-based premiums will be the click it or ticket for the flood business.
Well, I certainly know that it affected my thinking about how big my footprint would be and how long I would be on that footprint.
Next question.
Yeah.
Doug?
So that's the Gilbert White part of this that I think we need to pay some attention to in terms of human response. I mean, in the U.S. and maybe in the U.K. and other places, I don't know, in the U.S. there tends to be this win-lose mentality, this stubborn pride kind of thing, where after an event, I'm going to show you, Mother Nature, I'm going to come back and I'm going to stay right where I was and do this all over again until one of us goes down. And I can assure you that the odds are with Mother Nature on this one.
Tom Petty playing in the background.
Right. So, you know, how do you transition, to Roy's point, I guess, from the science through risk communication to change a culture? I think to some degree is what we're dealing with. And the science only gets you so far. I mean, you can put labels on cigarette packs, you can show black lungs to people, and they'll find ways to deny it until they come, to Margaret's point, to their own conclusion about how to deal with this. And the idea of adaptability does not seem to be a U.S. Kind of oriented philosophy that somehow we can overcome this by adjusting. So I don't know, I just ask the panel, how do we get beyond sort of this discussion about science, and if we just prove it to people and, you know, we'll get laws in place, and surely enough the laws will fix it. We've got to get into the minds, and so I'd be interested in folks' thoughts.
Volunteer?
Well, I think one of the things that, Doug, that we've seen that in bigger waters, one of the things that'll make me more responsible is give me the responsibility. If I have to pay for it, I'm going to be very responsible. I agree with Margaret. I mean, and that's why moving to actuarial rates is so extremely important. The other part of that, the elephant that we haven't tackled yet, is the Disaster Relief Act. And we keep throwing 100% money at people. They're still going to do everything they can to stay where they are. They may have to elevate that footprint, but they'll still be there. And so we've got a bunch of work we have to do. But once the more and more you push that cost onto them, it's a question of who pays.
Yeah.
Who benefits and who pays.
Go ahead.
I actually think I'm not sure that it's just going to be about economics and how much it costs and those kinds of things. I really think in the long run at the coast, as I said earlier, it's going to be about quality of life. If it happens once in 30 years, you clean up, you get over it, you're okay by the next time. When it's happening every few years, or when it is the school bus not getting in school because the road's flooded, then I think it just starts to wear you down. And that's when people just get out of town and move. And that's what they do in unprotected areas where, along the Gulf Coast, people gradually, haphazardly move. After every storm, some people move. A few people after the next one. And gradually, the really rural communities outlying on the coast are just lacking permanent residents. They may still have a lot of people going there on vacation, but the resident population in the smaller communities, I'm not talking about, major Florida destination kind of places, is really diminishing over time. And I think it's really just about quality of life eventually. It just gets old.
So I agree that we are not all motivated by economics, although for a lot of people it is a compelling topic, or at least a compelling part of the equation. The part about general persuasion. So here's one of my fantasies. I eat a lot of bad breakfasts with Rotary clubs. I've never been in a community that didn't have a bunch of Rotary clubs. And these people are often the folks who soon will be sitting on the planning and zoning commissions and the chamber committees. They're the wannabes, So I know that not only is there a big Rotary National kind of headquarters, so there's even a Rotary International. Some of you might even be Rotarians. But I know that Rotary clubs have national issues that they're all supposed to address, and then, they just do whatever they can to bring in a speaker to fill out their roster. I think as a community, we should actually go to Rotary National and talk with them about discussing maybe not just flood, but this whole issue of community resilience. And it begins at home. It begins in your business. And the business community's already gotten there with a lot of assistance from the Institute for Business and Home Safety. So they got the continuity of business ops thing down. Lots of them do. But I think we actually need to have a continuity of life campaign, because whatever Mother Nature deals out, I think you're right. But I also know, Denise, there are people down in the basin that no matter how many times they're flooded, they'll be back. Beast of the Southern Wild wasn't just allegorical. It was actually reality.
It was filmed right by my house, by the way. But but they're there. But why do they stay?
Because
they stay
they know
there because
nothing else.
I don't know, because there is a quality of that life which overweighs the other things.
There's
right?
a quality of life.
They make a deliberate decision because there are things there that they value. And all I'm just saying is that people do things for other than economic reasons.
Absolutely, but there are people there who have never lived anywhere else either, too. Mm-hmm. Some of them haven't even been to Baton Rouge.
That's a good thing.
Who'd want to go there? Okay, who's got the mic? Go ahead, Dale.
Maybe just a comment to follow Doug's, and I think it's the difference between the UK and the US psyche. We call it flood control and flood protection, which is pretty arrogant, where the UK calls it flood defense, which is an absolute. So just a comment that I'm struck by, just our own rhetoric there. A question I think for Roy, and then generally for the panel. Roy, you mentioned there's two audiences, those that have yet to have their disaster and those that are recovering. After Hugo, 18 months before that, I was delivering new flood hazard data throughout the Low Country, as Margaret knows. And, other than being called some rather direct names, was told, you know, it'll never be this bad. I mean, people in the sweltering August South Carolina sun saying, you're crazy. 18 months later, Hugo hits. There is inlets and devastation and blowouts and a whole new reassessment of the hazards need to be done. 12 months after Hugo, I happen to be with the same people. So these are people that haven't had my disaster yet. Now I'm there where they're recovering. And basically, and excuse the French, what in the hell are you doing here? We've had our disaster, leave us alone. And so I'm trying to understand what the psyche is, and I guess the other thing that came up in our discussion session, this is for the panel, is given those two audiences, does Sandy provide the opportunity with BW12 and some of the other things that didn't exist during, you know, all the other watershed events I've been through in my professional career, Hugo, Opal, the 2004 hurricanes in Florida, Katrina, Ike, you name them, and everybody goes, this is a watershed event, and here we are still talking about this, you know, almost 25 years later. So I guess the question is, how do those audiences differ?
So let me tell a story from the last 4 months. So this event plays out in New York and New Jersey. FEMA hasn't updated any of its flood insurance rate maps in this area in 30 years. We haven't published them yet. And we had some ongoing pieces, and so it resulted in these advisories. And we went through and made sure that the model, that things like Sandy had been in the model, 70 some odd tropical, 40 extratropical events in there. You push that back through. So the maps we push out, these advisories, are not about what Sandy did. They're about what we know how this has changed. So let me contrast the northern part of the state with Atlantic and Cape May counties. So northern part of the state, not only did they have, you know, something that approximates that 1% annual chance, but, to Jezreel's point, they had Lee, they had Irene, they had a whole series of these things that had basically been on this crescendo. So when we roll out these map products, these ways for them to understand the risk in those communities, they look at them and they want to fuss with you about the V-zone line in the Back Bay, but they go, seems like we should do something. Same product, southern part of the state, Atlantic and Cape May. These things cannot be right. Just impossible. Sandy didn't do this to me. I'm like, okay, well, you did not get the 1% annual chance. Let's start there. So let me make 2 points down that line. I don't know what we would have experienced up in Monmouth County if they hadn't experienced Irene and Lee. But because this had been a successive piece of it, it opened up the conversation. I hazard to guess what it would have taken if we actually would have rolled out these maps and people hadn't experienced Sandy, and we said all of your elevations are going up 3 to 9 feet. We would not have been greeted as victors and heroes. Things would have been propelled at us. But I look at this disconnect, because you go down to Atlantic and Cape May counties, and I want to be careful not to generalize every one of those communities, but you look at that, and they were not that far away from it. 50 miles, 100 miles movement of that storm produced a very different reality. So yes, we should be leveraging it, but it changes the messaging in both of those places. Because you go a bit farther down the mid-Atlantic, and people, Isabel's 2003, right? Well, you could have had this exact same Sandy event with its size hit this area. Well, it ain't going to happen here. It floods in Old Town Alexandria, and if they don't know how to get the flood walls up there in Georgetown, that causes a problem. But other than that, it's all fine. We tried to tell some people there were some flooding concerns in Washington, D.C., and we were told it couldn't be. They would pass a law to stop that.
Like North Carolina.
Exactly. Right. Sea level rise can't occur here. We have legislated this can't be, which I believe is something akin to what they did on the MR&T with legislation in 1929. But as you look at those elements, it requires different modes of communication. So I'm going to go back to Nick's point. So how do you communicate in this space? You do one thing at the community planning level. But at an individual level, we are seeing visualization makes a world of difference. Simply showing someone a two-dimensional extent of inundation is so passé and has little impact on folks. And so we walk into communities today with iPads, and we put in addresses, and they can see their house, and they can see where the water would go, and they can see the depth. And in the next few weeks, we'll be rolling out a tool by which you can actually begin to take and says, if I elevate by this much, what difference does it make? What does it actually cost me out of pocket? What difference does it make in those elements? And so, again, we are maybe paying too much attention to the economic and not enough to the social dynamics, to Denise's point, and I will grant that through my own I need to live under my own triangulation view. But we've got to make it a point by which someone can understand it to themselves. Otherwise, literally a storm that was 40 miles up the coast could have been 1,000 miles away.
Other comments?
Yeah, I wanted to comment on the fact that it isn't just economic. I've spent now hours on the phone with mayors and administrators of municipalities, and explaining the advisory maps, and letting them cry on my shoulder is kind of what it was all about. They need someone to talk to who understands it. They have that role of leadership to explain it to their public, and sometimes they can or sometimes they won't, but they need someone to talk to about it. That's something I think we need to understand, that leadership, when they get when they're in unrest, they go to the League of Municipalities or they go to their congressional offices and complain about the mapping. That integration with the local leadership is really important. And I'll tell a story. When Sandy hit, too, our association said, hey, we're a bunch of volunteers. We don't have any staff. We don't have an office. We need some way people can contact us if they need information. So we put my cell phone number on our website. So, anyway, it turned out to be okay. I didn't get hundreds of calls, but I did get some calls. And it was funny because I got a call from, I think it was the Bergen Record reporter, and we talked for a while, and then eventually he's like, this was great, and he said, we should keep in touch. And he's like, I really need your cell phone number. And I said, well, you're on my cell phone number. It was a little shocking for him, but communication is really critical. You need to arm the local leadership with good information, hear what they have to say, and be there when they need more information. The League of Municipalities in New Jersey is an extremely powerful organization. It is the home rule central. Way before Sandy, I got to know the executive director. That's a really important connection. He screamed at me at times, but he knows that I give him good information, that I'm a contact for him, and he'll send mayors my way. When he can't answer the questions, he'll just refer them to me, and that really helps. That really helps turn a volatile situation from going, from really taking off, and really and it takes a lot to undo that if that actually happens. So being there and being a communicator is really important.
Margaret? So all the social science literature talks about the importance of trusted local sources. You be him. So I think that's a really important issue. As Roy said, there's the people who've experienced it, the people who haven't. There's also, during or right after an event is not the time to establish a trusted relationship. It just isn't going to work. So it's something you have to do all along. Yeah. I also think we perpetuate, I liked your comment, Dale, about the language. That does make a point. If you think you can manage a flood, then you actually think you can manage a flood. So I think there's some other things that we do as feds that also do us a disservice. So I'll not just pick on ready.gov. My own agency has things called like Weather Ready and Tsunami Ready. And my complaint that I've made inside my agency, and I'll also make this now publicly about ready.gov, is checklists. Have I got my water? Have I got my whatever? Have I got my DOP kit? That doesn't actually make you ready. It makes you ready to flee. It makes you ready to do something else. But it doesn't actually prepare you for the event and the process that unfolds afterwards, regardless of whether or not you have water or food or shelter or your dog and your meds.
So let me, if I could jump on that. So yeah, absolutely, I can't defend checklists. They actually the research shows they don't work.
Right, exactly.
But we don't have something to replace them, so we keep them up. But let's go back to this trusted piece. So in FEMA, we do some research each year on people's understanding of their flood risk in the community and the local elected officials. So here's what we've seen now with pretty steady kind of numbers. When you talk to citizens about whether or not they understand their flood risk, we see numbers around 38% understand it, and that their community has a flood risk. And when you ask that question of the associated local leaders, the number is at 70%. So there's a chasm between these two. So when we ask the people in the community, how do you want to receive the information? Well, we want to receive it from our local elected officials. We actually think hearing it from the mayor makes a lot of sense. So we ask the mayors, so how should we push out the information?
From you?
No, use a website. And you begin to see this disconnect between the two. And so I think one of the things that we've got to do to help close this gap on the people side is spend more time with these elected officials, because some of this is the longstanding work that John has done, but the mayors in coastal New Jersey are an impressive lot who can describe more about flood risk these days than some people who are employed to do it full time. And they're looking at options and they're talking to people. And this may not be something they were expert in 6 months ago, but they are today because their community is looking to them. It's not the silver bullet, but when you engage the mayor and the economic development officials and the like in the conversation, it changes everything.
What's interesting is after the 93 flood, after Katrina and some other big floods we've had, we have in fact engaged mayors, non-governmental organizations have engaged mayors to go out to other communities as guest speakers. And I think we need to develop programs that will do that. Margaret?
One more comment following on Roy, actually from the seismic community. So in portions of California, both the feds, the state, as well as USGS has spent a lot of money on seismic risk education. And they've done websites and inserts into phone books and all kinds of things. But it still wasn't working for them. And then a few years back, you may know this story already, Roy, they actually used graduate students who went door to door in these high-risk areas. And the general conversation would go like this. Yes, I understand seismic risk. Yes, I understand that I'm in a seismic-prone region, but not my space. The other block, the other town. So cognitive dissonance is what psychologists call this. If you already have your framing and there's this scientific or technical information that comes in that's not consistent with your frame, you discount it. They don't know what they're talking about. Those scientists who talk about uncertainty, they don't know what they're talking about. Or it's not me, it's the other guy. So I think it's not just getting to council of mayors and the National Association of County Officials, and I think all that's important. But that's why I talk about the Rotary Club. You know, it should also be the person you play golf with or whatever, you know, that you get this from. Where are you in your watershed? Do you actually understand your relationship to Mother Nature? Kinds of things.
There's a lot of things that deal with that, and I think that'll be worth some more investigation. Vic?
Right. I had some questions for Roy. I want to continue with the social play because I really think the social fabric of life is very important. And so in your discussions about elevating homes, has there been parallel discussions about raising the infrastructure, especially on the accessibility to the elevated homes during the storm? And I'm coming at you from emergency management, fire official, public support, because when that home is inundated, surrounded by floodwaters, it's really hard to get there. I would not have the opportunity to rescue it from a fire if the electricity arcs and catches on fire. Or if someone has a heart attack, I need to get there. Has there been some discussions when you've been talking about elevating homes and the accessibility to those homes? during the storm?
There's been a good bit of conversation about it. I don't know that we have any good solutions to it. We talked about the fact that you should elevate your home, but in the International Fire Code essentially says once you get to, I think it's 38 feet, there's different kind of fire suppression requirements that are in that house that wouldn't otherwise be there. If you have communities that are beginning to build on pile, those local towns now need ladder trucks at their fire departments. Otherwise, they're looking from the ground up at them. I think this is absolutely true down in the Gulf Coast kind of realities as well. We don't have simple answers to that. But they are the kind of conversations that I'm hearing when I'm talking with mayors, because they're looking in that integrated fabric of their community and how do they hold the pieces together. I don't think there's a national or federal answer to it as much as to work with communities about what they need and what their future needs to look like.
Right, because that's an added cost.
Oh, absolutely.
It's not just a simple elevated home. That's the issue.
We've dealt with, so I had some of the mayors from Monmouth Beach and some of these guys in, and they start dealing with elevations. Well, you also have height issues as well as elevating, and they have some rules about setbacks, at which point they've actually, but now that you have longer staircases, it's changing these kind of dimensions. How much sand can you move around on the base of that? There's all these kind of interdependent pieces, and you got mayors who understand these pieces, and it has to be part of the conversation.
David?
I think Mike was first.
Mike.
Yeah, there's another element that I think needs some education, and that is our national icons. Ellen DeGeneres invited this couple out to California. This couple, they were first responders from New Jersey, and they spent, during the height of the storm, helping other people while their home flooded to 5 or 6 feet depth. But Ellen DeGeneres made arrangements with a local contractor to go to their home, fix it just like it was, and they did it just like it was. And the couple were were on the show, and the contractors were out there, and everyone was very happy about it. What a great opportunity missed to have that home elevated so that it wouldn't happen again.
Okay.
Well, it's New Orleans all over again, Mike.
Oh, she is from New Orleans.
My question, I guess, goes to John, and it is related to this. From what he said and what I've been hearing, in New Jersey, at the moment, it seems like the approach of the day is going to be more elevation than the land use issue, which is presented at the end of or after every major disaster. And then if we don't really grab it, Seabright, we've all seen the pictures of Seabright and what it looked like. And if what I hear happens, we'll get a third of the buildings in Seabright up on 17-foot, and maybe it will be a problem of getting a ladder out there because the building will be 2 stories and be on top of 17 feet or something crazy. Or then there's just the question of land use. And it seems to me that the federal government actually might have an interest in not fostering a situation where you have a third of the buildings rebuilt, still out with very little infrastructure support, but requiring it, and just a cacophony. I've studied, as everybody knows, the repetitive loss problem, and I've always worried about the fact that we seem to kind of wind up picking a few buildings, and we don't really do repetitive loss area management. We do repetitive loss building management a little bit. And in this situation, it seems to me that the federal government has to make some key decisions soon about how it will deal with its aid, what the rules will be, as Margaret referred to, what the question would be, am I right that we are going to get a real sporadic, cacophonic response under the current scenario? And is there something, could the federal government play a role in trying to help communities get through this planning exercise for recovery so that we don't wind up with a really odd, unsustainable result?
Full disclosure, David and I just watched the governor yesterday in a press conference where he said, we want to rebuild Route 35, we want to elevate homes, we want to give out grants for businesses because they're already in debt. And but I talked to Secretary Donovan, what was it, a couple days ago or whatever, and it still needs to be approved by HUD. And I think that's what you're going to, is the governor has a vision, but sure, I think the federal government has a role to play to say, yeah, well, that's our vision too. Or are we handing over this $1.8 billion as the initial block grant money? Is there going to be any kind of conditions on that money, or is it going to be just decided by the governor's office?
I didn't mention something that will cause the folks in the room to be concerned. And that is that the way this $1.8 billion is currently visioned to be used is to pay the delta between the insurance payments that the owner might have and the ultimate cost of elevating the building to whatever the ABFE height would necessarily be. So it will cause an enormous, it will pay 100% of these costs out of the CDBG money, so that people will almost have no reason to think about anything other than, do I mind having my house up at 15 or 20 feet up, and can my husband get up the stairs when we go to our vacation when we finally redo this? In other words, there's not even a cost share involved now, and that seems to be kind of a perversion to my reading of the federal money.
If I could ask Roy to address this. It's unfair to ask Roy. We have anybody from HUD out here today? Well, that's part of the problem. If you've seen the picture of Bolivar Peninsula in Texas, where there's one home standing in this entire peninsula, that's not just a matter of being elevated, that's a matter of being blown away. Yeah. I know you're responsible only for the water that rises, not the wind that rushes in. How do we develop the coordination at the federal level so that we're taking a whole risk approach to dealing with these sorts of things that David brings up? And Larry or anybody else that would like to comment?
There's a tremendous amount of coordination going on, and I would not come to the conclusions that you guys have come to based on those conversations. But those decisions have not been made, and announcements haven't been made. So let's see how that plays out.
That's good news for us.
Anything we can do. Keep on keeping on. I'll tell you that I am seeing some of the closest coordination across the federal family at very senior levels to work out these issues and try to pursue the right thing. And we're not going to be able to make everyone happy, but there are ways by which these programs come together. I'll tell you, I look back at some of the work that I've seen already in New Jersey that I believe will see its way moving forward. And so following Irene and Lee, a tremendous amount of money also went towards acquisition, and the state had seen its kind of checkerboard effect in the past, and they said that's not terribly effective, and they went to the communities and said the successful applicants will actually come in and bring entire pieces of land because it's competitive enough that we have choices to make. So it's not every third house, because they've seen this on the rep loss kind of space by which you create this kind of forsaken ghost town kind of reality. And New Jersey actually became a model that we've shown to other people in the country in terms of how that should be done, in terms of how that played out in terms of the investments in the Passaic. Right. How will that play out? We're very early still in this space. Let's see where it goes. I can tell you that you're not the only ones having the conversations like this. always is guidance related to CBDG dollars in these events. Let's see what it turns out to be.
Okay, thank you. The last question then is from our chairman.
Okay, I didn't realize this was going to be the last question. Okay, I toured some of the devastated areas by Sandy, like at Breezy Point, and I've never seen so much rebuilding in place from the recovery. Perhaps it's happened elsewhere, but I've never seen it to this level extent. I was wondering if the panel can comment on the challenges that we may face with all this rebuilding in place, and then what can we do as a private industry, the local community, the state, and the federal government to help the process move forward?
Any takers?
Well, it sounds to me, and I haven't had the chance to observe personally the conditions in New York and New Jersey, but it seems to me that it's too late to stop what's going on at the moment, and but that we have to really work out how to stop it happening next time. And I don't know. I was very interested to hear the discussion just now about collective land area buyouts, as opposed to the kind of jack-o'-lantern effect, which is what they called it in New Orleans and St. Bernard Parish, where you had one house here and one house here, and the rest of the block absent. And despite everything that you hear on the news about the lower 9th Ward and what a great success it is in redevelopment, it's still very, very much like that. It's very, very empty, with a few houses scattered around it. So it sounds like we have made some progress on the principles and approaches and the general. We may not be perhaps ready to activate that in quite the kind of disaster response mode that we will ultimately have to, because people really want it. If they have the cash and they have a builder and they know a carpenter and they can get the wood, they're going to start rebuilding as soon as they can get back there. I think that's just human nature. And unless we can be ready with a helpful intervention as opposed to an obstructionist intervention in that very early window there, then I think it's almost inevitable. But it sounds like we're making a lot of progress.
Well, I think you're going to see, I mean, in New York, Cuomo has said you're going to see some acquisitions and relocation, but that takes leadership. And we're going to see some of that happening more so in New York, I think, than New Jersey. There may be pockets in New Jersey. John, you know that better than I do, but my guess is that when the governor comes out and says we're going to look at these in neighborhoods that we know are not viable, not sustainable, it's foolish for us to help these people rebuild. We're putting them back in harm's way. So educating the leadership at the state and local level to do some of that. We're starting to see this. The more examples we get of this, the more ripple effect we'll see. We're seeing some of that in the Midwest. We're seeing some of that now in the Northeast. So you're going to see some of that. But it's a 35-year time frame that Margaret talks about.
But just the idea that, didn't somebody say that you could, just a blanket order that you could build without a permit, right? Is that what I heard?
It was public roads and utilities.
If you wanted to spend your own money to do it.
But what
if
about
the agencies wanted to spend their own money? What
about individual homeowners? Because often
it doesn't. That administrative order didn't apply to.
Well, that's good. I'm sorry, I misunderstood that. There was huge confusion in the months after Katrina about rebuilding permits within the city of New Orleans. It was complete chaos. I think would probably be a reasonable. It sounds like we're making progress on that, but I think there's still a real narrow sweet spot when you have to have a real constructive suggestion to somebody to change, and it's really a matter of days that it has to be realized in. I think we probably all know what needs to be done. It's just a matter of making it happen.
So we make a little incremental progress with each event. What we need is the campaign to help people understand and anticipate and be prepared for their disaster. So I think that we do tend to focus our efforts on the post-event, and I think, Roy, you really we really need a campaign for the people who haven't yet done this. And then I mentioned yesterday, there's lots of places in this country that are in hazard risk areas in which people have already walked away from their homes. And there are challenges in those communities, and I think we can be creative about those kinds of things as well as examples. So I think those kinds of things are important. I would hope, since we get very little done in Congress these days, let's acknowledge that our ability to have federal legislation, constructive federal legislation, is probably fairly limited. Although if Stafford Act were up for reauthorization, I not only want to emphasize the multi-hazard, but also the hard and soft approaches. So one of the things I've heard is you just talked about the importance of having a systems approach, a landscape scale approach to how we think about buyouts, and probably we should actually have that for how we think about elevations and setbacks, and as well as all the softer side of community resilience.
And that's where the mayors are going with this. And some of it you can talk about, but you can also look at a place like Hoboken. You got a historic town with brownstones that has a real flooding concern. And
two-thirds of the town is in the floodplain.
And
the Gold Coast.
They are wrestling with, so what does vitality look like? At a landscape level, in a 1 mile by 1 mile town, essentially, is what that is. It's not a simple, that's what the mayor, I was in her office, she goes, so you have any strategies on how I elevate a brownstone?
Careful.
I talked about how to fill in basements, and she wasn't a big fan of that. I said, make sure we get good venting as well. And she said, but what about the streetscape?
Right.
She goes, it's the only thing I have going for me. And
it's the quality of life.
It is the quality of life. And those are the elements that we've got to continue to bring together, because that social fabric meets their economy and the reality that the water just keeps coming year after year.
Well, we've come to the end of the panel. I would like you to join me in a round of applause for their contributions. Thank you very much. And we've come to almost the end. I've been asked to just give a few closing remarks. I think we've had a lot of closing remarks as we've gone through the afternoon, but let me quickly go over a few things. I was certainly impressed by the panel. What John said to start with, that we've already learned what we need to know for the most part. And now it's how we put it into action that we've got to think about. What do we do? How do we make that happen? We're seeing some examples in what both Roy and John talked about. Roy talked about this idea of having to deal with public and the private, and having to deal with people in general, and then where does science fit in that, and bringing these all together. That's clearly something we need to think about. The idea that we're actually seeing good decisions came out of this panel, and I think that maybe that leads to the topic that I would start off with. When we leave here, we ought to think about, yes, there are some negatives in what's happening, the challenges and risks we have, but we also have some tremendous opportunities to move ahead. I think we've been at it a lot longer than 35 years, Margaret, in trying to deal with this. Maybe it's time for us to come in and win some. So let's leave here, I would hope, feeling that we got together, we identified the challenges. What Doug has placed on the screen before you and what will come in the report is a roadmap to take advantage of these opportunities to change the way that we do things. Another thought that came up, and it's a simple one, and these are the kinds of things that sell, a few feet makes a difference. And we've got to understand, both in terms of the hazard and in terms of the protection, how we can find the message that's going to resonate with the people that are around us. Larry's comment, resilience is not sustainable, is not sustainability. We've got to know and understand the difference. And on that note, I would jump to, if you haven't seen the report of the National Academy from 30 November of last year on disaster resilience, a national imperative, it's on the web. It's had more downloads than any other report of the Academy. Look at it and see what it says. In it, what it really is saying is the nation needs a culture of resistance. resilience, not resistance. Culture of, we've got that already. How we overcome it and go to resilience. Because what we need to, and you've heard it time and time again, what we need to be doing is thinking about these things before the disaster hits, to have people prepared to make the changes that will make good sense. The definition in this report of resilience ends up with the words, yes, we want to be prepared to bounce back, but be better when we bounce back, to have thought things through so that if you know you have to expand the infrastructure, if you know there are people that should move out of hazard areas, you've talked it over with them. You've found a place for them to live. I was in Manila a few weeks ago. They have 800,000 people living in the riverbed. They're squatters. Just imagine being told, move those people out. Well, the government did come up with a great plan, and it's exactly the issue of quality of life. They found a nice area several tens of miles away from downtown Manila where they were going to move these people. But there's no jobs, poor transportation, and they threaten to have riots. And so they're going to figure out some other solution. We ought to be thinking about those things, whether it's the lower Ninth Ward or Seabright or Breezy Point. We ought to be thinking about those long before. So we've got to think about that. I thought the one theme that came out of here that was very important for all of us, and my iPad won't jump down to where I want to go, but that's all right, is the entire idea that we as a collective community have to become involved in Rotary clubs, decision-making. As a rule, and many of you may have heard me talk about the idea that there's a water box, a box of scientists and engineers who are so wrapped up in this that we don't reach out and talk to everybody else around us. And that's not just the Rotary Club. That's being involved in being on the Planning Commission, as some of you have been, going out and becoming part of the decision process, talking to your members of Congress and trying to tell them what you heard here today and what you told us today and yesterday. And so we've got to be more involved if we're going to see some of these things through, because it's obvious that unless we do, all of the good ideas that have come forward, when the report comes out, when that report's ready to be published, you ought to take it around to somebody in your chain of command, to the Congress, to the legislature, to the local communities, and share that with them. I think it's important that we recognize all that, and that we recognize that we've got to operate as a team. We didn't hear a lot of it. Roy made some very good remarks about the coordination that's taking place right now, but we've got to make sure that coordination continues, because very frequently, and I've been around long enough to have seen this in about 5 different major disasters, stretching over 40 to 50 years, is that we get the team together that makes something happen. Ed Thomas is there making a patchwork quilt for the Midwest. Somebody else is running a show in New Orleans for a short period of time, and those people become ethereal and disappear. So we've got to find out what we're doing right with this one, and we've got to carry it on into the next one so that the agencies don't vaporize all the good ideas that come out of this. And so I'd urge you to be part of, if you're there in the agencies, making it happen. If you're not, making sure the agencies do. We've had a great opportunity to listen to each other and to network, and I think that's probably the greatest benefit of this kind of an opportunity, to get together and work together and talk about the problems together, and then go back and stay in touch as we move forward. So I want to end this, my part, by thanking the ASFPM Foundation for putting this on, for tackling something that needed to be tackled, that was in mind long before we saw the waters pouring over the shores of New Jersey, and to be prescient on exactly what they needed to be addressing here in the year 2013. So thank you, Scott. Thank you, Doug, for putting it on. And I look forward to working with you all as we continue ahead with this. Thank you.